Here is a purple ink by Aurora Purple. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
As a purple, this is a little magenta leaning, though still being a purple. Some of the Aurora Anniversary inks show they should make more inks because they do a really good job on them. There is some slight tone variation by nib, and it generally has a nice light seasoning of shading, but it isn't the standout quality of this ink. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it feathers more than a bunch of the other inks I've tested on the papers I usually use for these reviews. Aurora is a solid brand for pens, and their inks are top tier as well, and I enjoy this even though I only had the sample. I could easily see using up a bottle with no real problem. I would like to see them very regularly have, maybe a new ink every now and then. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M120.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're going to get, as is normal with the soft fine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get that light peppering of shading that you see like on Hobbit on the third line, where the IT at the end does get a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Same with at top on the third line, where the P gets a little bit darker. More you tend to see some of the lighter to mid-tone in shading what's going on, kind of like what happens in Sparse, where it starts very light on the S and the par in the middle gets to a nice mid-tone. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do see some color variation. Now, not a ton. More you see it changing some color as it's writing from a darker version to its more regular version we're going to be seeing here. Now, if we see the word wondered on the third line at the right side, you see that the WON is a bit lighter than the DE. The R lightens up a little bit, and the ED at the end get dark again. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get little bits of shading there bobbed along. So if we look at there on the second line, very dark word the whole way through, but bobbed underneath it is quite a bit lighter as a word. Along right next to that shows us some of the shading that we can see, where A is a little bit lighter than the L into the O. It's during the O in the N and beginning of G, it's lighter. Downstroke of the G gets darker again. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get that light peppering of shading, like the crosses of the T's of that on the second line, or the last E of these correctly or directly to the right of that, had to the right of that, starts a little bit darker on the H and lightens up at the add at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get some shading. It does show up. You see it on the T of about on the third line, where it gets a little bit darker. The bottom of that B gets a little bit darker. Himself, the H is a little bit darker than the IMSA, but the ELF at the end do get a bit darker again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get nothing for shading, just an interesting tone of purple on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get only the tiniest bits of shading if you did wonder. Look at wondered on the first line, where the wonder is largely one tone. It's during that last ED, especially the D, where it darkens up quite a bit. He, before that, is quite a bit darker, and if you look at wood underneath, generally it's a lighter tone, but the W is a little bit darker than the OUL, and the D does get just a tad bit darker again. Looking at the broad nib, we get a little bit lighter tone than we had with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it has a light spattering of shading that you can hang on to. So if you look at hang on the second line, the H is a little bit darker than the A. The N darkens just a little bit. It's at the downstroke of the G where it does start to get dark again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, showing that this is a fairly opaque ink, not being affected by the tone of the paper. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get a little bit of shading, like on Bank on the second line. The B and the K are a bit darker than the An in the middle. Luck, also on the second line, the L, and during the U, it lightens up, but the LU is dark. During that U, it lightens up into the C, and the K becomes much darker again. So it does shade fairly well here with that soft fine. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather. Look at the L in close. Look at the word hidden that'll show up on the third line. You can find feathering fairly regularly here. Bit of spread going on, not out of control, but there is a little bit of spread. It does shade some, but it's the feathering and the spread that really draws my attention and makes me not want to use this ink on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. The spread is very, very minor. The feathering is much more noticeable, especially when you're looking at like scrambling or side on the first line. Plenty of other words have it, but those two stand out the most to me. Again, it does shade ever so slightly, but it's the feathering and the spread that distract me from what's going on and make me not want to use this ink with this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers, it spreads, it shades a little bit, but back to the feathering that's going on at top and on keep and on breeze and best he could. It's a lot of feathering. It's small featherings, but it's really consistent small feathers all over the place. Really, really not a good ink and paper combination. Looking at the back of the page, we can see why feathering was such a problem, as the ink does get very deep into the paper. Now, it never touches the page underneath, but the amount of ghosting that's going on, you could not use the back of the page to continue your note-taking.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Now let's take a look at that quad rule. Is it really standing out enough against the quad rule to stand on its own? I don't think so with the soft fine nib, meaning your finer, drier writing pens would not be a good thing if you use quad rule paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade better than it did on the Clairfontaine, but it stands out against the quad rule much better than it did with the soft fine nib. That little bit more ink flow, making it a bit darker, makes it really work here. So on your quad rule, there's a little bit of choice. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, shades as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Really stands out well against the quad rule. Really, if you use quad rule paper, this nib right here was perfect for it because the ruling in the background gets to disappear without any kind of problem and it's not distracting. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, it does stand out against the quad rule. Take a look at skipped on the third line. You see that it's not having any problem where the lines are crossing over the letters. The shading that goes on here is rather minor, like rather on the second line where the T crosses the H or the ER is just a little bit darker, so it's not a ton of shading, but it's still there and it's still a great tone on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Sailor Studio number 235. Here is Scribo Notturno Viola. Here is Schaefer Purple.
Here is Tasha Murasaki. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine, but it's the change in tone of the paper that I think makes it just as readable as it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it is not feathering, it is not spreading, it does have some shading that's going on. When it's shading like thinking on the third line where the H, K, and G are all darker than the rest of the letters. So I'm looking at it and I'm looking at the quad rule and sometimes it stands out, sometimes it doesn't. I'm going to call this really a miss with this quad rule paper. I don't feel like it's doing it. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It has a very light peppering of shading throughout. I think it's just getting there to be able to really stand out against the quad rule. This is not what I would really want for it though. In this case, I would still avoid it on this paper with this nib because I don't feel like it's doing it. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It doesn't really shade, but it does stand out against the quad rule. The thicker lines are really in its benefit here, and I think with this nib, this ink on this paper would work out for those student note takers. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather. It does not spread. The feathering you see in the first two words on the first line, very noticeable. Even on reflections on the second line, there's a few spots, stars and forest. It feathers some. Not totally distracting, not totally a problem, but this paper typically doesn't have this kind of problem with these inks, and it's showing up with the broad, which was a little odd. There is a very light peppering of shading that goes on, but again, I'm going to come back to, because this generally did well on this paper, I don't want to use this nib with this ink, this paper, just a bad combination. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Geherbon Lyre Sauvage. Here is Private Reserve Gray Flannel. Here is Geherbon Rose Tendresse. Here is Krishna Danu Udak.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, though it more frequently comes through, doesn't have those lightest areas. It does feather and it does spread. It is copy paper, so we should expect that. There's a couple of moments of shading. Now, the most important thing here is this actually usable? And I would say yes. From the soft fine, it is usable, though some of the areas do get a bit light and might have that kind of you're running out of ink feeling. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. We get some feathering, we get some spread. The feathering and the spread I think are manageable in what's going on here. I don't think I would want to use it at all. It's copy paper, so I accept more feathering here than I normally would, but I wouldn't accept the amount of feathering that's happening. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering and we do get spread. Both of those are user's choice whether or not you want to call them manageable. I'll say if I was just jotting some stuff down at work, I'd probably live with it and write a little bit larger, but I wouldn't plan on something like this. There's no shading that's going on. It's just an interesting color that you wouldn't get from a ballpoint or rollerball. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. It is an interesting tone. It is not an ink that I would want to use on this paper. It's just not doing well on most of the non-fountain pen friendly papers.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine, while the lightest tone, is generally easy to read on most paper. And this, as all of them did, shades well enough. Now, the wet fine is the darkest, generally speaking, but not by much. The medium is only slightly lighter than the wet fine, but gives a great tone on the page, and the broad is just a tad bit lighter than that medium and a little bit misses the mark for me by just that littlest bit. So for me, it's the medium flow, fine or medium, that I think really puts down the best tone on the page and just stands out as a tiny bit better than it was from the other pens.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.